Welcome to my YouTube channel, Scary Tales. Now you will dive into horror stories that will shock you. And you please subscribe to the channel, put a like and write in the comments from which page and city, and at what time you watch my video. Enjoy watching.
I had no plans to stay at the Parador Halcon that night. The truth is that my night shift wasn't over yet and I had to keep driving for a couple more hours. But I was getting tired, so I decided to take a quick break. I found the place purely by chance while flipping through a magazine, and it seemed like just what I needed. The magazine's advert said, "History and Luxury," and although those words didn't convince me, it was right on my route, and if I didn't stop to rest, I was afraid I would fall asleep at the wheel. The building was impressive, with that medieval aesthetic that makes you feel like you're in a movie, and I thought maybe the ad wasn't exaggerating so much after all. I entered the lobby expecting to find more people there, but instead I was met with a silence that made me a little nervous. There wasn't even any noise at the reception desk, and as I looked around I realized that the place had more of a museum vibe than a hotel vibe. Suddenly I saw an old lady approach the reception desk and greet me with a big smile. Taking another look around, I thought that maybe, without realizing it, I had ended up in a tourist spot. When I asked the lady at the reception desk for a room, she looked at me strangely, as if she expected me to know something more about the place. The woman asked me if I knew the history of the hotel, and I said no, to which she simply went to get the key, which seemed a bit strange, but I didn't think much of it. The lady came back, gave me the key to my room, and wished me good night, but something in her gaze left me pensive. Without wanting to delve any deeper, I turned around and went up to the second floor. When I got to my room, the first thing I noticed was that the door looked strange. The wood was more worn than the others and the lock had marks from use. When I opened it, I found a spacious room decorated with antique furniture and a huge bed, just what I needed. So after a quick shower, I threw myself on the bed, turned off the light, and in the blink of an eye I was asleep. I woke up with a start at 3:15 a.m. with no idea why. The silence in the room was strange, and for some reason I felt that I was not alone. I immediately looked towards the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar, and as far as I could remember, I had closed it when I left. I came up with a couple of explanations in my mind about it, but nothing convinced me completely. So I stood there, watching as the half-open bathroom door seemed to challenge me. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. So I got up, turned on the light, and went to the bathroom, but it was empty. I thought that maybe it was an old door and had its quirks, so this time I closed it with a sharp blow to make sure and went back to bed, noticing that the room was colder than before, almost freezing. Without paying too much attention, I got into bed and tried to go back to sleep, but it was then that I heard a thud, as if something had hit the floor. I looked towards the old desk a few meters away and noticed that a chair, which had been properly positioned, was now fallen over. I got up to find out what was going on, but everything seemed to be in order, except for the chair, so I straightened it, trying to convince myself that maybe I had accidentally left it in that position. But I knew it hadn't been like that. I went back to bed with my senses alert this time. The curtains were closed, the chair in place, and the door securely bolted, but there was something strange in the air. I turned off the lights, leaving only the bathroom light on, trying to ignore the disturbing noises, but the creaking of the floor started again, and this time it seemed like something heavy was slowly approaching my bed. Suddenly, the curtains moved for no reason, as if a gust of wind had pushed them, but there were no open windows. Alarmed, I ran to check the locks, but everything was in place. It was then that a whispering voice resonated behind me, and I turned around quickly, my heart racing. But I saw nothing, only an eerie darkness. As I searched for the cause of the whisper, the bathroom lights began to flicker. What the hell is going on here, I wondered, starting to get nervous. Taking slow steps, I approached the bathroom door, but at the exact moment I opened it, the spotlight suddenly went out in my face, leaving me in the dark, and as if that wasn't scary enough, the bathroom door slammed shut. I was frozen for a moment, and then I tried to open it again, but it wouldn't open, so I hit it with my fist, but it stayed firm. Suddenly, a noise started to come from inside, a whisper that turned into a kind of low, mocking laugh. I took a step back, feeling my heart racing in my chest while my eyes were fixed on the door. I heard footsteps approaching, but this time from the hallway. I ran to the front door and looked through the peephole, but I didn't see anyone. The footsteps continued to approach, making my nerves go wild. What was going on in that place? When I tried to open the door, the key wouldn't turn. It was as if some invisible force was keeping it locked. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and without thinking, I looked around the room, noticing that the curtains were wide open, and behind the window I caught a glimpse of a dark, still, and unmistakable shadow. I walked towards the window slowly, with a chill running down my spine with every step and ready to scream for help. But before I got there, the light started to flicker. The shadow disappeared, but in its place, there it was, right in the corner by the wardrobe, a tall figure standing upright. It had an inhuman appearance, as if it were made of nothingness itself. It had no eyes or mouth, but I could feel it watching me. At that moment, I backed towards the bed, looking for anything to protect myself with. I grabbed the desk lamp and held it in front of me as if it were a weapon, while the figure remained motionless. Then the murmur returned, a chorus of voices that seemed to be arguing at the same time. The figure wasn't talking because it had no mouth, but it was clear that it was listening. I could feel that the voices were trying to tell me something, but it was a language I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the shadow lunged towards me, and I was completely overcome by panic. I started to scream like crazy while I banged the lamp against it with all my might, but it passed through the light as if it were smoke. I felt an intense chill in my chest, as if something had passed through me. My legs wobbled, and I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Gathering my strength, I got up and ran toward the main door. This time the key turned without a problem and the door opened. When I went out into the corridor, I felt that something was following me, so I looked back, and that's when I saw that the shadow was coming at an alarming speed. Without thinking, I ran down the stairs shouting for help. My heart racing, I went down to the lobby, but it was deserted. There wasn't a soul in sight. I hid behind the reception desk, trembling, hoping that the shadow would leave me alone, but then I heard footsteps approaching. Suddenly, everything stopped. The noise stopped. There was no shadow, no whispers. Everything went silent, and it seemed as if nothing had happened. I carefully got up and saw that the hotel's main door was open, and without thinking twice, I ran to my car, got in, and started the engine without looking back. I didn't even want to go back to get my things. After that horrible experience, I did some research on the internet, and what I found made my blood run cold. Several people had had similar experiences in that same room, room 22. Some even said they had been attacked by something indescribable. Since then, I promised myself I wouldn't stay in old hotels, and every time I pass near that hotel, I make sure I take an alternative route. There are certain things that are better not to face, and room 22 of the Paranormal Halcon is on that list. I was never one to believe in horror stories or supernatural things. To me, they were just ideas that people told to scare others, and they didn't make sense. At least that's what I thought. Because if you dare to live like a brave man, nothing can stop you. So there I was, in the 24-hour library, doing my night shift while enjoying a good book. Books have been my passion since I was a child. My mom always said she wouldn't let me sleep if I didn't read at least 2 every night. I loved doing that on my own. So maybe that led me to see myths as fantasy rather than reality. The library wasn't very busy that night. Some students were there preparing for exams, and others were simply bookworms, just like me. I just needed to make sure that no one took any books without signing them out, so I decided to dive into a book myself. So I got up from the counter and headed to the shelves in search of an interesting book to pass the time. In the middle of my search, the famous myth of the library came to mind, which said that there was a book with a ghost behind it. It was rumored that anyone who touched that book or tried to take it would be cursed by the spirit of the author. Among the stories, they said that the ghost tormented its victim for the rest of their life, or at least for 24 hours. They said that the author had died before his work was published, and therefore he wanted to protect his writing from unwanted hands. I found it absurd, of course. How many copies could there be? Or did it only exist once? When I got to the section where the book was supposed to be, I noticed that no one went near it, and not even the cleaners touched it, which is why it was covered in dust. So when I saw it on the shelf, my curiosity was piqued. Without thinking twice, I took it out, and to my surprise, it wasn't difficult at all. I thought a book with a ghost behind it should be hard to touch, but I was surprised to find that I had it in my hands without complications. I cleaned it a little, getting rid of the dust. I couldn't leave a good book in such a condition. When I opened it, I realized it was a novel I had never heard of, except in the horror stories that were circulating. I decided to take it back to the counter and read it during my shift to see how interesting it was. Then I saw that it was a thriller about a serial killer who seduced his victims before killing them. Strangely, it captivated me, and at the same time, I felt sorry for those who stopped reading it because of that ridiculous myth. Because the truth is that it did seem to be a great story, and worth reading. The reading was so captivating that by the time my shift came to an end, I had finished the book. So I decided to return it to the shelf. Carefully, I placed it where I had found it and cleaned the shelf a little. And then I returned to the counter to inform my replacement that I had read the book, and everything had gone well. However, she just shrugged her shoulders, almost as if she didn't care what I had done. And so I left that night wondering if the myth was really as terrifying as people said, or if it was simply an excuse for no one to dare go near that forgotten book. I thought I had won the battle against the myth of the ghost book, and I left the library feeling very brave. And so I drove back home. It was still dark, and although my eyes seemed tired after hours of reading, I just wanted to get into bed after a good shower. Once I got home, I took off my clothes and went to the bathroom. I brushed my teeth, and after a brief rest on the throne, I decided to take a hot bath. However, instead of enjoying that peace, I began to hear strange whispers in my ears. They were soft and subtle murmurs, as if someone were talking right next to my head. I looked around, completely convinced that I was alone, and of course, there was no one there. I tried to ignore those murmurs while I washed my body, but a few seconds later they returned. This time the words were clear. Love doesn't always last, neither does life. A chill ran down my spine as I realized where I had heard that before. It was a line from the book I had read that night, that famous book that was supposedly cursed. It was the phrase the murderer repeated before finishing off his victims, those women he had fallen in love with and then killed when they wanted to leave him. When I read it, I found it interesting. However, hearing that phrase whispered in the bathroom made me feel different. I was overcome by a fear that I had never experienced in my 30 years of life, so I jumped out of the bathtub and decided that it must have been a figment of my imagination, a hallucination caused by the intense reading and lack of sleep. I completely ignored the fact that, perhaps, there was a grain of truth in the myth. When I left the bathroom, I went to face the mirror, hoping that it was all a bad dream. But what I saw made my blood run cold. In the mirror, in red letters, were written the same words that I had just heard. If someone had asked me at that moment, I would have sworn that I was angry or something similar. But in reality, what I felt was much worse, an overwhelming fear. I couldn't believe it. I tried to wipe the words off the mirror, as if that would erase the evidence of what I had just experienced, and I left the bathroom looking for my pajamas. I got dressed and got under the covers trying to find some comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in my room. The whispers and that voice were still there, as if they followed me wherever I went. I hate to admit it, but I began to regret having read that book. At one point, I began to feel as if my head was spinning backwards and my eyes were about to close. I didn't know exactly when sleep overcame me, but I did know that I was asleep because in the end I woke up in the afternoon hoping that the torment was over. I hope that those who spoke of the ghost were referring to a one-day curse, not a spirit that could torment you for life. When I felt in control of my mind again, the haunting presence seemed to be gone. However, at the end of it all, I ended up resigning from my job at the library. I began to think that perhaps myths weren't just stories invented to scare people. Perhaps sometimes reality was stranger than fiction. From that moment on, every time I passed by the library, I felt a chill and I never wanted to go near the cursed book again. I was beginning to believe that some things are better left alone. Let me tell you about a strange experience I had when I was working in a convenience store. At night, the place would fill up with strange and curious people, so I had to deal with all sorts of crazy and bizarre situations during my time as a cashier. Once an old lady came in who seemed completely harmless, but she caught my attention from the moment she arrived. Most customers don't even bother to greet the cashier, and the fact that she did was a small break in the boring routine of every afternoon. Grandma had been wandering the aisles for about 20 minutes, and when she finally arrived at the counter, she only had a can of peas to pay for. That aroused my suspicions immediately, so I scanned her, hoping she would leave soon. But before she could leave, boom! A bar of chocolate, a rather expensive bottle of wine, and several bags of sweets fell out of her huge coat. On another occasion, 2 young children who looked like twins, although they were not identical, came in. They were about 12 or 13 years old, and that night, while I was trying to collect the money, I heard a commotion in the candy aisle. When I went to see what was happening, I found the mess of cereal and juice spilled on the floor, while the kids laughed and recorded the scene on their phones. That day I almost lost it with that pair of kids, and not to mention the time a lady found her husband shopping with his mistress. God, that was chaos. But none of those are the stories I want to tell you today, but rather an experience that really left its mark on me, so here it goes. It was a very boring Wednesday, just like any other day that week, and I was really glad that nothing strange had happened up to that point. Suddenly, a guy came in. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, but very thin, as if he were always on a diet. I remember that we made eye contact at that moment, and that, for some reason, he particularly caught my attention. I don't know if it was intuition or because he was wearing cowboy boots with snakeskin trousers that were too tight. The fact is that something about him intrigued me. Instead, he only gave me a sideways glance and completely ignored me and walked straight past, heading directly for the frozen food area. I noticed that the guy picked up a couple of whole frozen chickens and put them in his cart, followed by a couple of tomatoes and potatoes. All normal so far, but when I thought he was going to approach the counter to pay, he paused, as if something had made him change his mind, and then he stopped. I don't know why, but a strange feeling ran through me at that moment, and it wasn't long before I heard a loud noise in the grocery aisle, right where I had seen him leave. I ran toward the sound and almost had a heart attack when I saw all my jars of peanut butter scattered on the floor, and just as I suspected, there was the guy, bending down, watching the jars rolling at his feet. "What happened here, sir?" I asked him, not quite understanding what had happened, but he barely looked up and replied, "It's not my fault," before turning on his heel and walking past me as if nothing had happened. The guy went straight to the counter, placing his chicken and vegetables on the conveyor belt as if nothing had happened. Oh well, it's not the first time a freak has been late, I thought. I tried to keep calm. After all, I was alone in the shop and it was past 10 p.m., so I didn't want any trouble. In the end, I went back to the till, scanned his products, and tried to be polite. "Have a good night, sir," I said with a forced smile. But he didn't even look at me. He just grabbed his bag and ran out of the shop, as if he were running away from something. I stood there for a while thinking about how rude he had been, but it wasn't the first time I had encountered customers like that, so I decided not to give it another thought. I went to pick up the scattered peanut butter jars, which took me a long time to rearrange. Fortunately, I didn't see that guy again all week until the following Wednesday, when he came into the shop again wearing the same clothes and with the same strange attitude. Just like last time, He went straight to the frozen food aisle, picked up some chicken and vegetables, and then went back to the grocery aisle. A few seconds later, I heard a noise again in that area. I quickly went over to see what was happening, and to my surprise, once again, all the jars of peanut butter were scattered across the floor. Clearly, this was no longer a coincidence. It was evident that he had done it on purpose, so I confronted him about it. But again, his response was to say that it wasn't his fault, and even worse, that it was the peanut butter's fault. Are you serious? I thought to myself, fed up of dealing with problematic people. Sir, you'd better leave the shop, I said, clearly irritated. It's not my fault, he shouted at me, and at that moment something in me broke. I told him I would check the security cameras, and if he didn't behave, I was going to call the police. But then the guy started shouting again, repeating the same phrase of "it's not my fault, it's not my fault." The man seemed very upset, and I was starting to get nervous. He clearly had some kind of problem, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with it, so I asked him again to leave, and we ended up arguing. Just then, a lady came in and said, "Hey, what's going on here?" And for a second, everything stopped. The woman was standing right next to the peanut butter shelf, so she bent down and picked up a jar, telling me she needed to pay for her purchase. But that's when things got really weird and chaos broke out. It happened too fast. Seeing the woman pick up the jar, the guy immediately turned to her and glared at her. "What are you doing?" he asked, almost shouting. The woman, a little confused, replied, "Buying a jar of peanut butter for my son. He's 10 years old and it's good for his health. I've always been a fan of peanut butter since I was a child. Why?" Despite the furious tone of the subject, the woman replied kindly. And for a moment I thought that might ease the tension, but I was very wrong. Suddenly, the guy went crazy. He grabbed a bottle of ketchup and with a quick movement hit the lady's hand, causing the jar of peanut butter to fall to the floor. But before the woman or I could react, he broke the bottle over her head and threatened to cut her throat with it if she touched another jar of peanut butter. I was completely paralyzed. Blood began to spurt from the poor lady's head, but now the guy fixed his gaze on me, and that terrified me. He looked me straight in the eye, and I clutched the broken bottle as if he were about to pounce on me. In that instant, I knew I had to get out of there, so I turned and ran towards the door, from where I saw the lady get into her car, covered in blood, and drive away. I got out as fast as I could, and once in the street, I called the police. Fortunately, they arrived a few minutes later and took the guy straight to jail. Later, I found out what had happened to this man, and I was shocked. It turns out that he had a difficult childhood. His mother was quite disturbed and fed him exclusively bread and peanut butter until he was 9 years old. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, can you imagine that? The boy ran away from home at that age and had developed a deep hatred of peanut butter ever since, as well as having an underlying mental problem. Now I understood why he attacked the woman when he said the jar was for her son. Upon hearing this, I really felt a little bad about what had happened in his life, but honestly, I feel even worse for that poor woman, who thankfully only suffered a cut and a bruise. I continued working at the store and ran into more weird customers after that, but none like that man. That night was really scary. I still remember my time working as a security guard at the Oaks Hotel. My job was to patrol the corridors, make sure the doors were properly locked, and take some calls from the few guests who were still awake. During the day, the place was quiet and comfortable. But when night fell, something changed in the atmosphere. I wouldn't know how to explain it, but every time the sun went down, a feeling of uneasiness would come over me. My work routine was simple. I would walk around the first floor, check the hallways, and then go up to the upper floors by the service stairs. Most nights went by without a hitch, because after all those years of being there, I knew that not much happened in a hotel. The Oaks had 5 floors, but it wasn't luxurious at all, just a small bar and a pool that closed early. But the maintenance areas were a world apart, full of narrow, dark corridors that gave me the creeps. I didn't quite understand why, but the yellowish light and the shadows it cast were unsettling to me, and the other employees felt it too. That night started like any other. I set my watch to 11 p.m. and began my first round. Everything was going well until around midnight, While I was checking the third-floor corridor, I heard a thud, as if something or someone was moving on the service stairs. It wasn't unusual for a guest to come late to get something, but when I looked at the cameras, there was no one there, so I decided to investigate. When I opened the door to the stairs, the light flickered in a way typical of an old building. I made a mental note that I should mention it to the manager the next day, and then I went down a couple of steps to make sure everything was quiet, and it was. I only heard silence. However, when I went back up, I heard the noise again, this time a rhythmic sound like footsteps. I looked down and there it was, a human shadow slowly descending the stairs right in front of me. It couldn't be that someone had passed by without me noticing, so I stood frozen as the shadow stopped, as if it knew I was watching it. Then it began to move faster, getting closer to me. At that moment, my instinct took over. I had no idea who it was. Maybe it was just a drunk guest who had got lost. But in that moment, the adrenaline made me slam the door and run away. I didn't even think about the possibility that it could be something paranormal. I just reacted. I ran down the main corridor trying to keep a cool head, but the truth is that I was very scared. Then I reached the maintenance area and opened an emergency door, and then the shrill sound of the alarm rang out. I was cursing under my breath, aware that I would have to explain to the manager why that alarm had gone off, but that moment made me forget my fear. All I wanted was to get out of there. But when I turned to look down the corridor, my heart almost stopped. That shadow I had seen before was now at the end of the corridor, completely still. I couldn't believe it. His feet weren't touching the floor and there was no sound of footsteps. "What the hell?" I said, as I stood still for a moment. However, I knew I couldn't just stand there and see what happened. So without thinking twice, I ran out into the maintenance corridors, dodging boxes and stacked equipment. Adrenaline was flooding through my veins, and although I couldn't hear his footsteps, I could feel that something was following me. As I crossed the corridor, I tripped over a rolled-up hose on the floor and crashed face-first onto the floor. A sharp pain shot through my right leg, and although I tried to get up quickly, the time I lost when I fell was enough for things to intensify even more. The alarm was still ringing, but the corridor was astonishingly silent. At that moment, I turned slowly, expecting to see the corridor empty, but no. The shadow was there, now closer. The disturbing thing was that it wasn't moving, but its shape seemed to change. It was as if it didn't have a defined figure, like smoke trapped in a strange space where the laws of physics didn't apply. My leg hurt like hell, but I still struggled to get up. I found a metal bar nearby and grabbed it tightly. I knew I couldn't hit something so ethereal, but I needed a foothold while I decided what to do. Suddenly, I heard a guttural sound echoing off the walls. It was deep and frankly terrifying. I tried to take a step back, but I bumped into a box, and that's when the shadow moved quickly towards me as if it had a life of its own. It extended what appeared to be arms, and before I could react, something cold wrapped around my neck and lifted me off the floor. I tried to hit it with the metal bar, but it was like trying to hit the air, and the pressure on my neck was unbearable. I was running out of breath and my feet were not touching the ground. In a last attempt to free myself, I hit what appeared to be its face, but that had no effect either. Suddenly, when I was about to succumb to the lack of oxygen, the shadow released me and I fell to the floor, gasping for air. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the terrifying shadow vanished. The hallway was still in darkness and the alarm was still blaring throughout the place. But now the sound was distant, as if I were dazed and had forgotten everything around me. I tried to crawl towards the emergency exit, but my broken leg made every little movement a torture. The next minute was a blur. The last thing I remember is crawling towards the end of the hall, just as I felt something grab me from behind. I fell face first to the ground screaming, but there was no one there. My hands searched frantically for the exit door, and when I finally opened it, I crawled outside, and it was only then that I felt a little safe. The further I got from the building, the faster I moved, crawling on the asphalt until my exhausted body stopped, feeling like I was at the limit. It was then that I lay on my back on the sidewalk at the entrance. looking at the sky and trying to process everything I had experienced. I don't know exactly how much time passed, but a motorist found me several hours later and called 911. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that I had a broken leg and strange marks on my neck and arms. When they asked me what had happened, I couldn't tell them the truth. I simply sent an email to the hotel manager saying that I wouldn't be returning. I don't know why, but he never replied, and I didn't want to find out what had become of that place. I have no idea if the manager already knew what was going on or if it was the first time something like this had happened. All I know is that I meant it. I will never set foot in the Oaks Hotel again. That night was etched in my mind forever, and the mere thought of what happened sends shivers down my spine. For a while, I worked at a gas station near a place called Foster in the Virginia countryside. I used to drive there from Glare, and my shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. My boss was called Judd, and he lived right next door, in an old house that he had built himself. I always thought he was a great guy, and although sometimes I doubted that he had really done everything on his own, as he said, the truth is that he was too nice to say anything to him. Not many people can say that they had a boss who would do anything to keep them safe, but I can. So sometimes I feel a bit bad for not visiting him more, but I've started to avoid anything to do with Foster, and in the end, you'll understand why. I worked at the station for 9 months and 3 weeks, doing shifts from 2 to 5 nights a week, depending on how busy I was with school. The place never gave me any trouble. In that sense, it was one of the best jobs I ever had. On the weekends, the place got a bit busy, but during the rest of the week, I could spend whole nights serving only 2 or 3 customers. Most of the time, I would watch movies on my iPod, which was the latest thing in entertainment. Judd was a pretty laid-back boss. He didn't give me a lot of tasks, and he didn't keep me busy. He had only one rule. If someone came to the station and behaved strangely, you had to call him, no excuses. It didn't matter if that woke him and his wife from a deep sleep or if it put them in a bad mood. It was his service station and his retirement plan, so it was important that everything was okay. I admit that at first that rule made me nervous. It left me with the feeling that there were a lot of weird people hanging around the station, although in reality nothing strange had happened in those months. One day, while I was in the back room dividing my attention between the security monitors and the new season of Game of Thrones, when suddenly I noticed a figure approaching. We had 3 cameras, one in front of the pumps, one focusing on the entrance, and another that let me see inside the store from the office. So I saw this guy walking towards the pumps, and he stopped right in front of camera number 2. The guy looked like a typical Virginia country boy. He was wearing a pair of worn jeans, work boots, and a baseball cap with some kind of logo on it. He was literally the most normal guy you could see coming in. However, it was his behavior that had me on my toes. Even though he had worked there without any problems for all this time, I remembered a previous incident that made me think about Judd's warning. One night, around 4 a.m., a woman had been screaming as if she were possessed near the pumps. She had called Judd, explaining the situation, and he told me to stay calm and that he would go. Fortunately, the woman left before he arrived. But now, with that man in front of the entrance, something about his attitude made me frown. I could see him standing right next to the shop door. And although he didn't look threatening, there was something strange about the way he moved or how he looked inside, as if he were waiting for something, so I immediately became alert. I couldn't take my eyes off him. The guy in the baseball cap stood motionless in front of the camera. It wasn't as weird as him screaming like a madman, but it was still unsettling. He just didn't move, and that got me thinking. It was as if he were waiting for something to happen. But just as I was watching him, his head started to turn slowly, as if he were looking directly at the camera. I don't know if it was just an illusion, but the feeling that he was looking at me made my hair stand on end. I had never experienced anything like it before. His behavior became really worrying, so without thinking, I grabbed the phone and called Judd. I didn't even feel weird about it. Rather, there was a guy at the station who didn't seem to be in his right mind. Judd was quick to answer, immediately asking what was going on, so I started giving him details of the weird guy, but right in the middle of the call, he hung up. Then I looked at the screen and the guy had disappeared. And not only that, but I wondered where the hell he had gone. The guy vanished without a trace. As I thought about Judd's strange behavior and hanging up, I noticed on the cameras that he was arriving, running towards the station. I saw him in shorts and holding a shotgun. He went into the shop and asked me, frowning, "Where is she?" And when I replied that she had disappeared, Judd's face turned pale. It was clear that something really serious was going on. He sent me to the office while he checked the recordings, but I had 1,000 questions to ask him, and he just told me to shut up and concentrate. He started rewinding the recordings until he found what he was looking for, and when he finally saw the image, his face went completely white. I had never seen Judd so terrified. His fear was so palpable that it filled me with panic too, and in that moment I understood that something darker was at play. That night, Judd decided it was best if I left and called the police to inform them of the situation. The next day, he called me again and said he would understand if I didn't want to come back to work. So I asked him, almost begging him, who that man was and why I was so scared to see him. But he just repeated that he could understand my decision not to return. He was silent for a moment, but I understood that it was something he didn't want to talk about, so I thanked him for the job and wished him luck, and then I hung up. Honestly, I haven't stopped feeling guilty about not visiting him again. Judd was a great guy and boss, but the truth was that I didn't know who the guy was who had scared him so much. The notion that something so disturbing could make Judd, such a strong man, feel that way filled me with fear. I didn't want to risk my life for a job at the gas station. Judd might be the nicest guy in the world, but if there was a guy out there who could scare one of the toughest guys in the area, it made me wonder, what chance did I have of getting out unscathed? This is the first time I've ever dared to tell something like this, but I feel like I should because this experience will be in my head forever. Just to put it in context, I'm a guy who works at a gas station in the heart of the South, in a part of Louisiana that almost nobody knows about. I'm talking about dirt roads with no names, trees so thick they seem to swallow the light, and if you're lucky, you'll see a streetlight every couple of miles. The gas station where I work is the lifeblood of this forgotten place. I work night shifts, and as you can imagine, the place doesn't get much traffic. Most of the visitors are possums prowling through the trash, so the atmosphere is pretty quiet. The shift started like any other night, making sure the coffee was fresh, checking the snacks and beer in the fridge. After doing all that, I just stood behind the counter looking at the inventory and listening to music for the first 2 hours. You know what they say, that time flies, but that didn't apply on that shift. I was so bored that I decided to go out to check the shelves for some air when suddenly, I heard a guy call out, "Hey, someone's there." And at that moment, for some reason, a feeling of uneasiness set in. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw 2 customers at the checkout. So my body, which had been startled, now regained its composure. But I noticed something. This station doesn't have that fancy system that warns you when someone comes in, so I was surprised to see those guys there. I hurried to the till and apologized for keeping them waiting. And while we were making the usual small talk, one of the customers said something like, "Gee, it's really dark in here." And the other asked how long it would take to get to town from there. I replied with the same phrase that I have engraved in my mind. "Well, it's a couple of miles towards the lights." It sounds silly, but it's true. When I finished scanning the products they had with them to continue their journey, a bar of caramel water and a few packets of biscuits, I warned them to be careful. There was a tornado warning in the area until 4 a.m., and the rain was starting to fall heavily. Even on a clear night, the roads were difficult to see and over time became more dangerous. At that moment, I looked over at the second customer and suddenly realized that he was no longer there. It seemed like he didn't want to wait any longer and had left. From what I saw, he didn't have anything in his hand. He probably just wanted some cigarettes that were behind me. I was bored and wanted the hours to pass quickly so I could finish my shift and go home, so I noticed that the clouds were getting darker faster than usual. Shortly after the other customer left, not even an hour had passed when the sky could take no more and it started to rain heavily. For me, it wasn't just a normal rain, it was a really strong storm, what I call hua, that is, humid and muggy. The thunder rumbled as if the sky were angry, and I could only think about how that night was getting stranger and stranger. I decided to stay by the window, watching the raindrops hit the glass, forming rivers that slid down the glass. But in the midst of all that chaos, something made me shudder. I looked through the window, hoping to find something that could explain my nervousness, but all I saw was darkness. However, there was a feeling in the air, something that told me I was not alone, even if the station was empty. My skin began to crawl, and the feeling that my nerves were on edge intensified with every second. When the rain and wind started to lash down, I knew the power lines wouldn't hold out for long. And sure enough, the deafening silence came when the power went out. I don't have a backup generator, so I was trapped in a darkness so thick I felt like it would simply swallow me up. I called my boss to let him know the power was out, asking what I should do. Of course, it was the middle of the night, more than 2 a.m., so nothing. I got no answer. I thought about closing up the station and waiting for the storm to pass. But right in the middle of the thunder and the pounding rain, I heard a creaking sound coming from one of the aisles at the back of the shop. At first, I didn't think much of it. Given the chaotic weather, my mind could be playing tricks on me, but after a while, it really bothered me. So I called my boss again, but nothing. And just after, the flashlight on my phone deactivated. Great, just what I needed, I muttered to myself ironically. As I tried to adjust to the darkness, I heard movement again. This time it sounded closer, but just as I called my boss again, the call was cut off by a loud clap of thunder. I've been following horror story channels for years, and at that moment I felt like I was in one of those stories I'd heard and knew didn't end well. Something was wrong here. Trying to calm myself didn't work. I didn't want to be the guy who overreacts, but what if I really wasn't alone? I decided to stay by the window to get some light, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. A while later, the storm began to subside, and after the heavy rain had stopped, everything was silent. I felt a little relieved, thinking that the chaos was over, but suddenly a figure appeared in the middle of the dark night saying, "Give me all the money." I was stunned. I couldn't believe what was happening. Then the guy said again, "Give me the money, I told you." I wish I could say that I made a heroic move that stopped him in his tracks until the police arrived, like in the stories I heard, but no. The truth is that I was terrified, and I simply did what he asked. I handed over all the money. He knew that, with this storm, the police wouldn't show up for a while, and even if he called, it would be a long time before he could get to the station. It was the same time that he had disappeared from my sight a while ago. It turned out that he had hidden behind some shelves, waiting for the storm to make his move. He had everything well planned. However, it's not like there was too much money in the till that night either. After getting what he was looking for, the guy immediately ran out of the place. After all, I ended up talking to my manager about what had happened, who apologized for not having answered before. I told him not to worry, that everyone deserved to sleep. Then he told me to leave and close the station for a couple of hours until the next employees arrived. I was so lost in what I had experienced that it was hard for me to assimilate that it had really happened. 2 months after the incident, I came across some shocking news. They found a guy trying to rob a service station near my work. It was a man I vaguely remembered, with the only difference being that this time, he didn't manage to escape. The only thing I can really take away from all this madness is that no matter how comfortable you feel or how predictable you think your day-to-day life is, you always have to be alert. Life can give you surprises you never expected, even in the most routine of places. It all started in a small hotel where I worked. On a random night, my coworker had already finished his shift and was about to leave. It was around 11:30 p.m. The cleaning lady was also there, and in addition to cleaning, she did some extra work that came up. To be honest, the lobby was emptier than a desert. The only company I had was the television, and to be honest, the night was quite boring. Suddenly, I received a call to my number that showed something strange. Instead of the typical 7-digit number, only the last 4 digits of the hotel number appeared. This usually happens when someone calls from a phone in the hallway, so I thought maybe it was a guest, but usually calls from the rooms go through the reception phone. Either way, I was a bit surprised, as I don't usually give my number to guests. Anyway, I didn't think much of it and continued to enjoy the peace and quiet, Googling things to pass the time and distract my mind. When I picked up the phone, a male voice answered. He sounded like a guy in his 40s or 50s, very lively and happy. He asked me how I was that night, which was a refreshing change as I was a little bored and didn't feel like answering the call, but I smiled and replied, "More or less fine," and he immediately laughed and joked. Then he asked me if I had received any noise complaints, and I was left thinking, wondering if I had actually heard anything strange that night. So I replied, "So far, no guests have complained. It's been a quiet night." As he was talking, I began to notice that there was another voice, a woman, laughing in the distance. I thought it was nice that this guy was having fun with his wife or something. Then he said he was calling because his sister-in-law was with him and she couldn't stop laughing. She laughed some more, and while I thought it was nice that he cared what the other guests thought, I was worried about the woman making so much noise. I told him that everything was fine and that it wasn't a big problem. Honestly, I was hoping he would say something else so I could end the call, but he kept insisting that everything was fine. Then he asked me a question that took me by surprise. "Do you know why she's laughing?" To be honest, I didn't really care why his sister-in-law was laughing, although I was struck by the word sister-in-law because, well, it was a double room. But as a reception agent, it was sometimes my job to entertain the guests, so I continued the conversation. He joked that he was tickling her feet. At the time, I thought it was rather strange that he told me that, but then I started to wonder why he hadn't hung up. I was trapped in a strange conversation that I didn't want to be having, while he kept laughing and talking about whatever. I began to feel the situation becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and the joy of the beginning faded. That simple call was turning into something disturbing, and, although the night seemed quiet, there was something weird about all this that left me uneasy and confused. But there I was, trapped in a meaningless conversation with a guy who just didn't know when to stop. I had no words to respond to this man because I was really left thinking, who the hell is this? At that moment, the combination of hunger, tiredness, and confusion left me feeling a little offended. Instead of just hanging up, I found myself laughing nervously and saying that everything was fine. Then the guy continued with his story, claiming that he was tickling his sister-in-law's feet and that she loved it. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop giggling nervously as I listened to this woman in the background, laughing nonstop, as if I were caught in a loop. While I was dying of embarrassment inside, he continued to talk, happy. "Yes, she loves it," he said. And at that point, his tone of voice became serious, but I kept thinking, why don't you hang up now, mate? Then the guy launched into saying that he was enjoying the situation and kept talking about this strange dynamic. I tried to interrupt him, but the conversation became a bit disturbing when he asked me if I also liked having my feet tickled. "Does tickling my sister-in-law turn me on?" he said. At that moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or run away. This guy didn't call because he was worried about the noise, but here he was talking about some kind of twisted game with his sister-in-law, while I was at the reception dealing with this strange situation. I couldn't believe I was caught up in this, talking about something so weird with a stranger. So in my head, the idea that the sister-in-law was laughing like crazy became increasingly strange, especially as she hadn't said anything during the whole call, apart from laughing. I was in an endless cycle, feeling like a fish out of water. To make matters worse, just when I thought I could hang up, someone arrived to check in. I tried to be professional while the guy kept talking about how he tickled his sister-in-law's feet. I felt compelled to stay on the call, as if it were my duty to help this man. But of course, with every second that passed, he seemed crazier and crazier. He hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted me to stay and chat a little longer, but his voice was lost in the laughter and screams of the woman, so I took that as my cue to hang up. I closed the blinds in the lobby and stayed behind the desk, alert, unless someone really needed me. The funny thing was not so much the madness of the conversation about feet, but that the unusual call came through from an unknown number that had neither the surname nor the room number visible. I had no idea who was on the other end of the line, and honestly, it gave me a chill down my spine. Worst of all, rather than the man tickling his sister-in-law, which was already weird, the woman's laughter sounding in the background felt like a high-pitched recording, and that's what really freaked me out, making the night take a strange turn, and I just wanted it to be morning. I never found out who that person was, but that was the only time I ever received a call like that. It was disturbing and strange, and well, I wanted to share the experience.